Well, this is something completely different. Sea level rise, climate adaptation, and social science. There's some modeling to motivate the social science, which I will explain in a little bit here too. So this is part of a project, Resilient Infrastructure Seas Rise, Rise or SF Bay. So this is a National Science Foundation project that is a partnership between Berkeley, USGS, ourselves at Davis, NYU, Abu Dhabi, who's a professor who used to be at Berkeley. And what we're looking at is the interaction between sea level rise in the Bay Area and the hydrological modeling around that, the transportation infrastructure that's there. So if you flood something due to sea level rise, what happens to the transportation system, what sorts of protective infrastructure you might put in there in terms of gray infrastructure or more green infrastructure. And then on the governance side, which is the part I study, how do you get all of that stuff to happen by getting all the stakeholders to cooperate with each other? So thinking about how all those systems work together. On the modeling side of things, and this is what Mark Stacy at Berkeley has mostly done, really motivates the governance side by saying there's interdependence in this system, and we need to understand how that interdependence plays out for regional cooperation. So for example, on this one right here, what we did is flooded Berkeley and then used our transportation model to show what the regional transportation impacts would be, to make the argument in terms of vulnerability interdependence that it's not just a local problem. You're going to have vulnerability to sea level rise, and the effects of that are going to spread regionally because of the connectivity and the critical infrastructure. And there's a big transportation model behind this that's validated by, it's like an agent-based model. It's validated with cell phone data, so you can see where people are coming, where people are going at a very high level of resolution. So you can get these sorts of results, where the red means increased traffic, as you might expect. And this is probably for some of I guess most of you are modelers in the room, looking at what will happen to expected sea level rise and flooding if, for example, you protect the shoreline in Alameda Bay, then you're going to move water to San Mateo. Sorry, Alameda County, you're going to move water to San Mateo. If you protect the shoreline in San Mateo, you're going to move water to Alameda. So it's showing the hydrodynamics of the bay with sea level rise, that the adaptation activities of all of the different local areas are likely to affect each other because the water moves around the bay in a particular way. And again, just like with this, that means we got to figure out the cooperation problem on the governance side to get all of these different actors, counties, cities, hundreds of special districts, state, federal agencies to try to work together to deal with this problem on a regional level. So we got to get this governance side to adapt, and that's basically the part that I'm looking at. The problem with the adaptation of governance is that governance is really a messy situation. So it's a little hard to see these lines here, but this is just the center of the governance network for sea level rise in the Bay Area. All of these little blue squares here are like are decision-making processes of various sorts. So this is like integrated regional water management, and there's a few other ones in here that are all related to climate change adaptation, water, and sea level rise in the Bay Area. So all the decision-making, the deliberations, the discussions, where the science is being developed and where the science is being communicated, it's all over the place. And this is just like a center. There's actually over 100 different of these blue squares that we've measured as places where sea level rise is being addressed. And then all of these red circles are different organizations, mainly in this diagram, state and federal agencies like BCDC, for example, that are participating. You can't see the lines very well again, but they're participating in all these processes. So, like most of you in this room probably recognize this, like Sonoma County Water Agency, you probably have to go to lots of different blue squares to get to deal with the policy. So basically, from the governance side, it's always a really messy system, and it's something some of you probably know. Phil Eisenberg, public policy is always a mess. Let's acknowledge the inevitable and figure out how to manage that messy situation. Trying to define the problem is hard enough. Trying to find a solution is harder. And we have these structures in California and really everywhere where everyone is involved but nobody's in charge. So how do you get the cooperation in those sorts of structures? That's basically what I'm studying. So in the Bay Area, it's really interesting. All those blue squares, like I said, there's over 100 of them, and I like to drink wine sometimes, so we kind of gave the vintage of all of those blue squares, and you can see the ones around sea level rise. This is where they start when they started. So you can see as sea level rise comes on board in the Bay Area, you get a response of the governance system by creating a lot more different projects and planning processes that are there to address the system. So you see that this is a typical type of thing, response for a new type of collective problem that they're facing. So we tried to understand the cooperation in that. This is the research that we did. I interviewed people at the state, federal agencies, local levels. Obviously, I can't interview everybody in person. We're about to send out a quantitative survey of this, and I have over 3,000 people on that list in the Bay Area involved with sea level rise adaptation. So I was looking at a lot of the leadership involved with that at the core agency. So I interviewed 43 individuals for about an hour. We did focus groups. So via this, I identified a lot of problems. Then we did focus groups where we asked people to identify the solutions. And then we came up with this report. I've run out of copies, unfortunately, but you can find a nice glossy report that covers this on my website, or you can contact me if you want a copy. So, the study found a lot of agreement that sea level rise is a problem. Pretty widespread agreement that there's some mix of gray and green infrastructure, where there's some uncertainty about how well the green infrastructure will work. An emerging awareness of the interdependency I pointed out to you in the modeling slide, but a really widespread disagreement on how to solve the problem, how to get over this governance gap. And we identified 7 specific challenges. So how do you build institutions for cooperation? So how many of you have worked in the Bay Area, like the Bay itself, know BCDC a little bit? So the BCDC is like the big state agency that permits shoreline development. So the question, for example, is, should BCDC be in charge of sea level rise planning? Just they take over everything? Or do we have to create a new agency like the Delta Stewardship Council in the Delta? Do we have to do a version of that in the Bay Area to deal with climate change and sea level rise? And you probably immediately sense that some people say, oh, if BCDC takes over, it's just a power grab, and they're going to want to have all the money, they're going to want to have the authority, so that's not going to work. And then they say, well, no, we need a new institution. Then as soon as we say we need a new institution, well, that's another source of authority, another source of red tape. What are we going to do about that? So you got to figure out a way to navigate that. Planning. Who will do the planning? Are we going to have a single plan to rule them all for sea level rise, or is it going to be multiple parallel plans going on in multiple regional processes? Where's the money going to come from? There's just Measure AA passed in the Bay Area that has about 1/3 of the funding for what they would target for the wetlands restoration, but the rest of it, we're not quite sure. And there's hundreds of millions of dollars we're talking about to think of more, billions of dollars really to deal with the infrastructure needs for sea level rise. Where's the best available science going to come from? A group like this is an interesting group from that perspective, how you get the best available science, not only identify what it is, but communicate it in a way that decision makers can use. I think probably all of you recognize that not a new portal is not enough. You need some sort of translation going on between the science and the decision makers. How do you integrate the permitting? So if you're going to put in like artificial restore wetlands, for example, you might need 5-6 different permits. How do you go through that gauntlet? How do you integrate that? At the very least, it takes time. Lots of times they come up with conflicting decisions. On the human side of things, or at least the citizen side of things, how do you get the people engaged? from the bottom up to think about climate change and sea level rise, especially in the Bay Area, where, for example, you have disadvantaged communities, some of which are really more concerned about the housing crisis than they are concerned about climate change 50 years from now. And then the political leadership, and there's a bit of a gap there, I would argue, coming all the way from the governor's level, being more focused on mitigation and things like California water fix relative to sea level rise in the Bay Area. All right, so those are the challenges, and then what we did is basically came up with like a menu that said what are the different possible options that you might use to address those challenges. So here's all the challenges, here's the menu, and in the report I write about every single one of these menu options. So it's kind of like you go to a restaurant and you say, what meal would you like to assemble? So from a decision maker perspective, you can pick and choose. But then we highlighted kind of the chef's recommendations. What are the things that we think are the best ones that might help solve some of these problems, or at least move the ball forward on overcoming this cooperation problem and governance gap that we're seeing there. So this, don't want to necessarily go through all of them, but for example, planning and institutions, I think we need to have an interim step where there's a governor appointed or legislatively appointed visioning commission that tries to establish the vision for moving forward and then figures out what the more permanent institutional solutions will be there, because we're not ready for the more permanent institutional solutions. There's not enough agreement. The money's going to have to come locally, most likely, with a variety of different funding mechanisms. I don't think we can have a lot of faith in the federal government, especially not right now, and probably not ever, to give enough money to deal with the infrastructure issues. And the state government with the various bond acts is just not, there's not enough money in there to solve all the problems that they have with infrastructure in the Bay Area. Permitting, create a new integrated permitting strategy. There's a team for dredging that already exists for integrated permitting for dredged material. That's actually won some innovation and government awards, so we should probably do that for sea level rise and green infrastructure. Create a science policy services center, which possibly could be legislatively created. Have an integrated civic engagement strategy, and then try to reinitiate some California legislative leadership that was in place previously, but reinvigorate that using these informal networks of legislators. For example, the Bay Area Caucus, and there was at one point a sea level rise caucus, which is like groups of legislators that get together and try to come up with legislative strategies and have hearings and do political entrepreneurship to try to move things forward. All right, so what else are we doing around here? We're doing more of that network analysis like I showed you. We're working on it, so we did public opinion surveys of Bay Area residents in every single zip code in each of the counties, nine counties of the Bay Area. So for example, we asked them, how much do you think sea level rise will harm you personally, will harm the Bay Area, will harm the U.S., will harm developing countries, and harm in the future? And you can see that how much people think it's going to hurt them personally is pretty low. The risk that they see is more for developing countries in the future, not for the Bay Area and for themselves. So if they don't think it's going to hurt them or harm them, they're unlikely to take action. And then right now, we're developing a big quantitative survey. If you work in the Bay, if you work on sea level rise at all, you're very likely on my list. So if you get a survey, it's an online survey to ask you your views on this and participation and ideas. Please answer it, and ask your colleagues to answer it too. So there'll be more on this governance stuff from our group, and then eventually we want to integrate it with the hydrodynamic modeling, and we've got a number of ideas of how to do that. But we want to more technically tightly couple the modeling, the social science, and the hydrological and transportation modeling. We'll see if we get there. That's hard to do, but at least we're in the same room talking with each other a lot and thinking about how we could possibly cross over between the social and the biophysical sciences. But we may have a more integrated modeling effort forthcoming. So that's it. Thank you very much.